Howl's Moving Castle is a very famous movie that I've loved for a long time. It was one of the first Studio Ghibli movies I've seen, and it's based on a book, but not everybody knows this, and for the longest time I had never read the book until very recently, and then immediately after I watched the movie to really contrast and compare them. Even just going through the book by itself, I noted so many differences. The two are so different, and today I really just want to talk about all these differences, the similarities that are here, but really just the things that separate these two, and just go through them, mostly through the characters, but also just like the overall tone and setting. And at the very end, I'll be giving both the book and the movie my rating. So just a warning, there's gonna be full spoilers for both the book and the movie here because I really want to talk about both in depth, and to do that, I need to talk about spoilers. And starting off here, we're going to talk about the tone, the vibe, and the overall setting for both the book and the movie, starting with the book. The Howl's Moving Castle novel has a much more whimsical and charming tone that I came to really like by the end of the book, and I say it feels a lot more G-rated, and this is probably a middle grade level book. It'd be great to read to your kids if you had kids, or honestly, if you're just kind of in a mood for something pretty lighthearted, this is a great thing to read. The setting here also surprised me because I'm really familiar with the movie. I've probably seen the movie at least 5 or 6 times now, and like I mentioned at the beginning, this is my first time reading the book. And something that caught me completely off guard is that this is kind of a portal fantasy. The real world, like our world, is actually a part of the novel as well, and the world that Sophie lives in is kind of the magical world. And Howl is actually from the real world and then travels to Sophie's world to be a wizard, and that's where he spends most of his time. I'll dive more into Howl in a little bit here, that's one of the major sections of this video, but just the difference there is pretty significant. And now I want to touch on the overall vibe of the movie. The movie has a much more romanticized, dramatic vibe, and it has a PG rating, and I feel like it definitely leans more into that, especially with the war. The war is a much larger aspect of the movie. Howl's bleeding out for a bit of it. There's just more violence present here. And I also will say that despite this being a bit older now, I think it was made in 2008, the presentation here is absolutely jaw-dropping and stunning. Studio Ghibli is just timeless when it comes to their animation and design. And the score by Joe Hisaishi, the soundtrack here is just amazing. The man knocks it out of the park. He never really misses, and I feel like he doesn't get as much love as he really should. So unlike the book, the setting in the movie is just pure fantasy. It's all in this fantasy world. There's no connection to Earth as we know it, or any lands like Wales, which appear in the book. Another aspect of the movie is that there's big warships and planes and cars. And when I was watching the movie, I was just thinking that Miyazaki just cannot help himself. He loves airplanes and stuff like that too much that he can't resist putting this cool stuff in there. And it's really fun to see. It makes the world feel more fantastical, but that is not an element of the book at all, really. Sophie's world seems like a more medieval style fantasy world. In the books, well, at one point, Sophie travels to Wales and she rides around with Howl in his car, and she's like, what is this crazy carriage thing? So that's a pretty big difference as far as setting goes between the two. And now we're going to jump over to the characters. The central cast here between the book and the movie is the same. We have Sophie, we have Howl, we have Calcifer, and then we have Michael. His name is Michael in the book, and then for some reason in the movie they changed his name to Markle. But the same cast is here between the two, but the actions of the characters are very different between the two, and even the age of some characters. Michael in the book is probably right around 15 years old, and in the movie, Michael seems like he's probably 8 to 10 years old to me. He's more youthful, and that is actually kind of nice, a nice vibe that the movie brings. Michael's very lovable in both the book and the movie, though. Now, diving more into the characters, let's start with Sophie, the protagonist of both the book and the movie. Sophie, her full name is Sophie Hatter. She comes from the Hatter family, and her profession is being a hatter. Her family is a super important part of the book, and in the movie, you really don't get that so much. I'll just give you the layout of the Hatter family in the book right now. Sophie is the youngest of 3 daughters. Her father and mother had Sophie and her next sister Letty, and then her mother passed away, her biological mother. Her father then remarried to another one of the shop workers, I'm pretty sure, And then they had the youngest daughter, who is Martha. And then Sophie's father passed away. And when Sophie's father passed away, she had finished schooling, but it turns out that he was putting them through a pretty expensive, nice school, and that they're in some pretty dire financial straits. So what happens is that Sophie's stepmother sends all the girls out to get jobs. And there's a great relationship between the whole family. Sophie really likes her stepmother, and they all get along. They treat each other like just regular family members. So Sophie's stepmother just keeps Sophie at the hat shop being a hatter, and then she sends Letty off to the bakery, and then she sends the youngest one, Martha, who is her daughter, to be a witch. So one of the major themes that is here in the book is this whole idea that the eldest sibling is the one that is the most likely to fail, while the youngest sibling is the one that's the most likely to succeed and have the most ambitious life. And this kind of permeates the whole experience for Sophie throughout the book. It has shaded so much of her life and her outlook on things that she's just destined to be less ambitious and go through less journeys and just have a less fortunate life than her younger siblings. And I feel like this is something that the book does a great job with, and it really probably connects more with kids that obviously have siblings. So if you're a kid of that age, and maybe you're the eldest sibling, or you're feeling like you're the one that's not as prestigious in the family, this book will probably connect with you a lot more. And I think this is an aspect that the movie really just doesn't touch on at all. So let's contrast this with the movie. In the movie, there is also the Hatter family, but we don't really get any of this background. In the movie, Sophie just has her sister Letty that she goes and sees relatively early on. And there's something that carries over here where all the men are fawning over Letty. That's another thread from the book where Letty is just this gorgeous lady and all the men want Letty. And just to give you some idea of the age, I think Letty is probably like 15 years old in the book. And we'll get more into that later, but Letty's also very beautiful in the movie, and all these men are very attracted to her. And in the movie, Letty is working at the bakery, which is a nice tie-over. So then, what about Martha? Well, in the movie, Martha's not there at all. And if you're actually listening to some of the background dialogue that's happening when Sophie's wandering around the town, you actually hear fairly early on that you get some background info on Howl, basically, some of his lore, and you hear that, oh, Wizard Howl stole this girl Martha's heart from another town over. So basically what they did is they cut out the character of Martha. She's not Sophie's sister. They just kind of threw it in as a reference and used it to paint some of the background around Howl and how the people kind of see him and they fear him. So as I've mentioned, Sophie's family plays a major role in the books. They're there for like the whole time, and they're very involved with Howl even. And the curse, so let's talk about the curse now. A major aspect of both the movie and the book is that the Witch of the Waste comes and she lays a curse on Sophie, which turns Sophie into an old lady. The thing that's different though is the intent of the witch laying the curse is different between the two of these. So in the book, what happens is that Sophie's sister Letty and Martha actually change places. So Letty is actually the one that wants to be a witch. She has more potential in that area. And then Martha just wants to have a big family. So she goes and bees a baker. And this is also kind of breaking that theme that was established, or going along with the theme rather, that, you know, these societal norms as far as what the children will be, all these girls in this family are breaking it, because Martha is actually the one that wants the most simple life, and she's the youngest, while the middle sister and Sophie are both the ones that want to go on more adventures and have a more prestigious life and just be more adventurous. So Letty and Martha change places in the book, and then Letty becomes an apprentice witch. And I guess she catches Howl's attention pretty early on because she's beautiful too, and the witch goes searching for Letty Hatter. She comes across Sophie in the hat shop, and she thinks that Sophie is Letty, and she lays the curse on Sophie. And then we go to the movie where the witch lays this curse directly on Sophie because of Sophie's involvement with Howl. In the movie, very early on, Howl has this attachment to Sophie. He encounters her. They kind of go on this nice little romantic escape from some of the witch's goons, and they kind of start becoming involved a little bit, and the witch is envious of that, and that's what leads to her laying the curse. And there's one little other reference I want to shout out here, is that the dialogue that they use for the guard that's kind of hitting on Sophie, that Howl takes her away from these weird guards. That's actually a line of dialogue that Howl uses to hit on Sophie in the book. So Howl does hit on Sophie a little bit there, but Sophie gets away from him very fast in the book and then doesn't really encounter him again till later. While in the movie, the two are more directly romantically involved right away. So the curse lasts for most of the duration of both the book and the movie, but I do want to address how people start finding out about the curse, because one of the things about the curse is that Sophie can't outwardly tell people about it. So in the book, I think it's actually funnier how it happens in the book. Howl just kind of knows that Sophie's under a curse, and Calcifer, I think, also tells him fairly early on that Sophie's under a curse. He tells her later, he's like, yeah, I'm a pretty good wizard. Of course I know that you were under a curse. Also, a big thing is that Howl is chasing Letty. He really wants to get with Letty. And also, this is one of the weird things where Howl's like probably mid-20s and Letty's like 15. So it's this kind of weird dynamic. The book doesn't like write it in a weird way. It's just like the age gap now seems weirder. Maybe when the book was written a couple decades ago, this was like more okay, but definitely now it seemed kind of weird. But one thing is that Letty actually ends up telling Howl that her sister is missing and she wants help. So Howl really knows for probably most of the book that Sophie is just under this curse, and he's actually trying to get Sophie help for a good portion of it. And then there comes like the boiling point where Sophie finds out that people know about her curse and that they've known the whole time, and she gets pretty upset about it. And that was actually pretty funny, that it's kind of like a joke that, oh, everybody just knew all along, and she thought it was like this big secret about her identity. Now, the curse in the movie plays out a bit differently with how Howl discovers that Sophie is cursed. Maybe he knew all along or such, but they make it very apparent. You know, things have to be written differently for a movie. And the way it's portrayed is that the curse kind of stops working when Sophie's sleeping. So one night Howl comes home, he opens the curtain and he sees Sophie there, and she's very young, and he's like, oh, well, obviously we see Howl knows. So he knows for a good portion of the movie as well. So there's one last thing with Sophie that I'll talk about before jumping over to focusing on Howl, and that is Sophie's magical ability. In the movie, this is basically just completely gutted and gone. And in the book, I actually really like it. And it builds from the very start of the book all the way to the end of the book and plays a major role there at the end of the book. And it's actually how Sophie's able to break the contract between Howl and Calcifer and yet save both of them. So in the book here, we get that Sophie is almost like an enchantress. She's able to speak power into objects or things. And it's fun because, like, I think the very first chapter is called In Which Sophie Speaks to Hats. And Sophie just kind of has this trait where she likes talking to inanimate things, and she's working on these hats and she's talking to them. And one of the very first hats that we get is that she makes this really nice hat, and she's like, oh, you'll have to marry into wealth. She's talking about the lady that's going to buy this hat. Oh, you'll have to marry into wealth. They go sell the hat. The lady that buys it does marry into wealth, into a super wealthy guy, and then everybody else wants that hat because this lady has this hat and she's all rich now. So there's hints the whole way along. And then also we have the walking cane. In the movie, the Scarecrow delivers the walking cane to Sophie. But in the book, Sophie speaks strength into this walking cane, into this stick, and makes it a very good walking stick for her. So like I said, hints the whole way along. Then at the very end of the book, Sophie's able to use this magic she has to say, I want Calcifer to stay alive, but please return Howl's heart to his body. And through that mechanism of magic, Howl is saved and Calcifer is saved, and the contract is broken, but yet still both live. And then Calcifer breaks her curse as well, now that he's kind of unshackled and held up her end of the bargain. All right, now let's talk about probably the other most major character, and that's obviously Howl. And we've already talked about him a bit here as far as in context to Sophie's family. So in the book, Howl is a much more of a skirt chaser, or he appears to be, or this heart stealer. In the movie, like I've mentioned, he just kind of becomes involved with Sophie very early on, and you never really see him going after any other lady. In the book, it's very different, where he hits on Sophie early on, and then what he ends up doing is seemingly, for most of the book, going after Sophie's sister, Letty. And this is very frustrating to Sophie, because she knows that Letty's this beautiful girl, And she just feels like, oh man, this is just another thing I can't have. Because one thing in the book is that you do notice that Sophie is really falling in love with Howl throughout the whole duration as she keeps learning more and more about him. And you can feel this frustration building up in her that, man, this is just another thing that is denied to me because of how society works and who Howl is. So Howl is chasing after Letty for a long time. I don't really know how much of it was serious intent. And then at another point, he finds out, Letty wants to meet with Howl, not because she's in love with him, because she wants him to save her sister. And then Howl ends up going after another character, Lily Angorian, who is just completely absent in the book. And she's definitely a major character that I'll talk about more in a bit here, but she's a beautiful teacher, and Howl really goes after her, and that frustrates Sophie a ton too, because Howl just keeps chasing skirts. And I do like that they added this in a bit more, because it really lends to this whole thing about Howl stealing ladies' hearts. Like I said, in the movie, we just get kind of background mentions of that. We don't really get to see it happen. While in the book, you definitely see it happen, but Howl's actually true intentions behind it all are more pure than it seems. Outwardly, it seems like he's just this kind of greasy dude that just, wants to get with these girls. And then once he has them, he loses all interest. He talks about how the whole fun of it is the pursuit, kind of. But how much of it is actually him doing these things to try to help Sophie out is kind of unknown. Because, like I mentioned, he does find out fairly early on that Sophie's under this curse and he's trying to help her out. Another major aspect that's in the book and also there in the movie, but I feel like in the movie they kind of made it not as relevant, is Howl's cowardice. He tries to blacken his name everywhere. He wants to make himself seem unreliable, too cowardly, like he always runs away. And in the book, they definitely do a better job of this. There's just more time that you can spend with Howl and that whole little family unit to see these properties and traits of Howl. And Michael really kind of helps explain this and shed more good light on Howl, that a lot of the things that Howl actually does are at the detriment of himself while helping others. Like, he'll make spells for people while not charging them. And Michael actually has to be there to discipline Howl to say, hey, we can't get by unless you end up charging people for services. Yeah, it's great that you're doing this for people, but we need to eat and live too. So you got to charge some money. In the movie, I don't think the cowardice of Howl is really that well portrayed at all. The biggest thing that happens as far as maybe saying that Howl's a coward is when he sends Sophie to the king to say, oh, tell the king that you're my mother and say that I'm too cowardly to go, fight his war. And in the book, it's a little bit differently. The king wants him to find his brother. The war in the book is just so much smaller and far away from everything. In the movie, it's a major thing. I'll just get to talk about the war now because it's a very big part and it does tie into how I feel about the cowardice portrayal in the movie. So in the movie, there's this big war that's happening, and the war is being fought because the king doesn't know where his missing brother, the prince, is. Throughout the entire movie, we can actually see that Howl is actively fighting in this war. Because he comes back home and he's all beat up, he's in his other form. So literally the whole movie, it seems like he's been fighting in this war, and then he's like, oh, I'm too cowardly to go fight for the king. But obviously he's been fighting in this war to some degree, just because of how he looks. But maybe he is just trying to fight the witch's minions. It's kind of unclear. And then near the end of the movie, that's when Howl kind of has this turning moment where they have this new house. They've taken over the old Hatter shop that Sophie used to live in, and they set up home there. And then the warships come, they start bombing the area, and the big fight breaks out there. And Howl says, he tells Sophie, I'm going to stop running away. I'm tired of it because I finally found something to protect. It's you. And that's kind of, really establishing the love more directly. The romance is really just more upfront, direct in the movie through the whole runtime. So I do want to speak about the war too a bit more, just outside of the context of Howl and Sophie. So the war, like I mentioned in the book, it's hardly there. I don't even know if there is a war going on. The king does have troops and his brother is missing, and he does want Howl to find his brother, but there's not this big active war that's soaking into all other areas of the world and the story. So I did some research about why the war was such a big topic in the movie, and it definitely seems like Miyazaki was injecting some of his own personal thoughts about the Iraq-American war at the time, and he really didn't like what was going on there, and that definitely just made its way directly into the movie. So during the time period when this movie was released, it probably would be a lot easier to put that together, but going back and watching it now, it's probably a little bit harder to put two and two together. It's definitely interesting when you go back and do some research and see, but even for like the young crowd that this was meant for at the time, the kids were probably putting this together. But it is interesting to see. He is definitely injecting his own thoughts into this piece, though, that is, inspired by the work of another person. The war in the movie is very kind of hazy. There's a couple lines of dialogue that I really like where Howl and Sophie are out in the field of flowers, and then the warships come, and Sophie's like, oh, whose battleships are these? And Howl's like, does it even matter? Because the chaos and the war and the death is just infecting everything. At the very end of the movie, Madame Sullivan, who is Howl's teacher in the movie, the prince is found. She's like, all right, great. Now let's end this stupid war. The sides are very hazy throughout the whole thing. I don't think it's even stated who the king is fighting. So it's just kind of this foggy thing in the background that, ends up blowing up everything else. So I did like the war. It definitely gives it a more dramatic sense in the movie, though. Circling back to more things about Howl specifically, another thing I wanted to talk about was his origins. In the book, he is from Wales. So, like I mentioned near the very beginning, there's the real world and then the magical world in the book. And we actually get to meet a fair few members of Howl's family. And the Witch of the Waste is actually really trying to get to the real world to get to Howl's family, to get to his weak points. You end up meeting Howl's sister and his niece and his nephew. It's pretty cute. And Howl's sister thinks he's just this big, lazy guy, his layabout, while actually Howl can't really tell anybody that he's going to this other world and being a wizard over there. So that was pretty interesting and definitely something that caught me off guard completely. I did not expect that at all. I do know that the second book in this trilogy of books is called I think The Door of Many Ways. So that makes me think that there's going to be a lot of traveling to different worlds in there. And it sounds like all of these books are like tangentially related. They all have different protagonists. The last thing for Howl that I got to discuss is Calcifer. Calcifer is obviously a major character in both the book and the movie, and he is Howl's fire demon. And I think the origins of Calcifer are explored a bit better in the book. Once again, you have more time you can really kind of spend with these things. Sophie and Michael at one point in the book go try to catch a shooting star to complete some spell. And once Howl finds this out, he tells Michael never ever try to do that again. And it's because Howl has gone and done this. He's caught a shooting star. He made a contract with a fire demon. And I really think that the book does a good job of portraying what a good guy that Howl actually can be. And his true nature through this Calcifer story. Because what Howl does is he goes out there to this field, and when the shooting stars, in the book it's better described, when they come and they explode, there's these little the fire demons or the shooting star, they go and they run and they die just in like a minute or two. And in the movie, you can see this too, but it's all just portrayed visually. There's no dialogue explaining any of this. You just have to put it together. But in the book, it's more thoroughly explained. So Howl he caught a shooting star and he felt really bad. He wanted to save the thing's life. So they formed the contract that would save the thing's life and then also kind of benefit Howl magically. But he did kind of do it out of the goodness of his own heart to save Calcifer. I really like the visual portrayal of all of this in the movie, and I do think reading the book and then going to the movie here makes things a lot more clear about the contract being formed, the dying stars. So I think this is one area that was actually one of the most enhanced areas by knowing the source material in the book for the movie. All right, now one of the last major areas I'm going to talk about, and that is the antagonists of both the book and the movie, because this is an area where things are so different. In the book, the primary antagonist is the Witch of the Waste and her fire demon. Her fire demon is Lily Angorian, Miss Angorian, that teacher I mentioned earlier. That was actually her fire demon in disguise. And that fire demon actually ends up becoming the literal last villain of the book. So the big last villain of the book is not in the movie at all. And in the movie, our big antagonist is Madame Sullivan. So Madame Sullivan is way different in the book and doesn't even have the same name. What they ended up doing here is taking Miss Pentstemon, who is Howl's teacher in the book, and then giving her the name Sullivan from another character in the book, Wizard Sullivan, who is a pupil of Miss Pentstemon. So they just kind of mashed up some characters here to get more references in, and then said, Madame Sullivan, this is basically an evil Miss Pentstemon from the book. So now going back to the book and the Witch of the Waste. So the thing that the Witch of the Waste wants to do in the book is that she wants to make the perfect man. And the missing prince is her doing. And then there's this other guy who I kind of mentioned earlier, Wizard Sullivan, who's also missing. And she's taken parts of these two men and combined them like a jigsaw puzzle into this incomplete being. And then what she wants is she wants Hal's head, I think, and his heart to finish the perfect being. And then she wants to marry that. She'll be the queen, he'll be the king, and they'll rule all the lands. So that's ultimately the Witch of the Waste's objective in the book. That doesn't happen. Hal ends up being able to beat her and gets rid of her. I think he just kills her. He folds her back. And then it turns out that Lily Angorian, Miss Angorian, is the fire demon of the witch. And she's actually been manipulating the witch to this purpose because the fire demon wanted to create the perfect man to enter into a contract with. Luckily, Sophie and Hal are able to work things out here in the book, and they're able to beat both Miss Angorian and the Witch of the Waste. And then at the very end, the kind of last two chapters, there's the romance really flourishes to the forefront, and the two of them kind of have their happily ever after. So many different characters from across the book come there at the end too, with all of Sophie's family and a bunch of other characters. But Hal and Sophie are really just kind of focused on each other, and they want to be happy together. Another thing the Witch of the Waste in the book does is that she just straight up murders Hal's teacher. In the movie, that would be Madame Sullivan, but in the book, it's Miss Pentstemon. So Howl has Sophie go visit Miss Pentstemon to see if she can get her curse fixed. That's the real intent of it, but Howl's telling Sophie to blacken his name. And after that visit, the Witch of the Waste kind of just comes through and murders Howl's teacher, and that really leaves Howl in a foul mood for a fair bit of the book there too. And then last thoughts just on Madame Sullivan, just that there's a pretty bad relationship between Howl and her in the movie. She seems pretty vengeful, wants to control that which she can't, and kind of disarm everything, all the wizards and witches that aren't under her thumb. And really in the book, the two get along great. And like I just mentioned, Howl is really shattered when he finds out that his teacher has been murdered by the Witch of the Waste. So that's really all my thoughts here. One thing I do want to mention is that these two are so different. With some adaptations, you get close enough, but then you wish some elements were brought over. This is a case where the movie is just so different from the book that it really helps them exist as two separate entities in my head. And it makes them very easy to distinguish. I'd say that they start off kind of similar, and then they just branch further and further apart by the end of things. And now it's time to put my rating on these two. For the book, if I had to give the book a rating, I would probably go with a 3.75 out of 5. I enjoyed the book quite a bit. I did the whole thing on audiobook, and the narrator did a great job. I really liked her voice for Calcifer. Really nailed that kind of whimsical, lighthearted tone, and I think it was a great experience, and I definitely recommend people check out the audiobook for this one. There's a few narrators, and I'll put here in the text the name for the narrator that I used. And then for the movie of Howl's Moving Castle, man, this is kind of a tougher one, because I like the movie so much, just because I've seen it so many times. There's a lot of nostalgia there, but really so I read the book and I was like, wow, I think I like the movie a lot better. And then I watched the movie again, and I really reflected on a lot of things that I think the book just does better with a lot of the themes. They connect more to the audience that's kind of probably watching this. But I still have to give it up for the Joe Hisaishi score and the presentation. I like the romance more, I think, in the movie. That's kind of just there the whole time. But some of the reveals in the book are great too. So the movie, I'm kind of at a 7 to 8 level. I won't put a hard score on it right now, but right between that 7 to 8 out of 10 level. So that's probably like a 4 out of 5. And that's about it here. Definitely let me know down in the comments below if you like the book or the movie better, or if you haven't seen one. I really want to hear people's opinion on this. I was kind of looking at Goodreads reviews, and a lot of people seem like they like the movie better, but I feel like the movie is just way more famous, and because of that, it really kind of paints people's expectations of what's in the book, and the book's just a different thing. That being said, I think the book is probably more famous over in England than it is anywhere else in the world, and the movie has a bigger global presence. If you liked the video, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it, and make sure you subscribe for more book videos. Have a good one.